you can hear me. Welcome to this panel on Europe in a Competitive World. I'm Fabian Zulik, the Chief Executive and Chief Economist of the European Policy Center, a think tank in Brussels. And it's my pleasure to moderate this panel today. Welcome to all of you in the room and also to the people on the live stream. I think it's a very good moment to discuss Europe in a competitive world. I would say Europe in a competitive and in a contested world. We live in interesting times, difficult times, where there are unique challenges for Europe. Not only the watershed moment of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, but great power competition, the perma-crisis as we have termed it, the transitions we have to go through, and a world where my country first is becoming more and more the motto countries seem to be following, and that raises big questions about where Europe positions itself, what kind of Europe do we need to deal with these challenges, and what will happen to the global multilateral order, what will happen to Europe's relationship with countries like the US, with countries like China. So a lot to talk about today, and we have a great panel to talk about these. I will introduce the panel as we go along. We'll start with a short statement at the beginning, and then we'll go into a discussion and some questions and answers. So first of all, thank you very much for being here, and we will start with Jessica Roswell, the Minister for EU Affairs, also hearing a bit about the Swedish Presidency and what your plans are in this competitive and contested world.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Fabian, and maybe I will not be that short, but because we have a lot of things to talk about, but I think it's a very, very interesting agenda that you have had also these days. But ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, so thank you, Tepsa, for inviting me to discuss this and for your valuable recommendations for the presidency. It is less than a month left until the third Swedish presidency and the Council of European Union. From experience, we know that this is an opportunity to play a leading role and set the Union's agenda, but also knowing that it's a chance to boost this government's competence and capability. Our government took office just 3 months before the presidency, so that's, of course, quite a challenge. But I expect that starting with the presidency is the perfect way to forge a strong pro-EU government, which we'll need for the whole term of office and beyond, as me and Cecilia just talked about a little bit. So, for a new EU Minister of EU Affairs, what can one wishes for? And it's not even Christmas yet. So, dear friends, we will take the helm when Europe is in war, and we have major difficulties in Europe. So it's not the best of times, but some of the worst. It's a time of emergencies and crisis management. So when we do what we have to do, but also a time when we act together and in unity, because we know that doing so makes us much stronger. At the same time, we know that the strength of our union depends on something more than short-term action necessary to steer clear and immediate dangers. First and foremost, our strength and standing in the world derives from a robust economy, backed up by societies based on common fundamental values and rule of law. Therefore, we need to get back to basic and step up our efforts to strengthen the EU's competitiveness. We must safeguard the growth that we need to stand strong and regardless of crisis of the future. This is the way to assert the EU's place in a competitive world. So I thank Tepsa for making this a key recommendation to our presidency. Let me briefly highlight a few essential aspects for Europe, which will be central during the Swedish presidency. First, we must safeguard the security of our citizens and strengthen the EU geopolitical importance. It goes without saying, we must aid Ukraine's fight for freedom with maximal political, economical, military and humanitarian and legal support. And we must do that in unity. We must develop our cooperation with other countries. This include a revitalized enlargement process. And we need strategic relations with many other countries, especially with allies like US and the UK, who have been instrumental in providing support to Ukraine. But we also need to find a way to continue our cooperation with China in areas such as climate issues. And in both cases, we need to find a common European voice. The EU needs to diversify our supply chains and not put all eggs in one basket. As former Commissioner Malmström is well aware of, the Union must establish open, strong and sustainable trade relations around the world to accomplish this. Therefore, we will ask for open trade with partners like Australia, New Zealand, like Mexico and Chile, and like India, Indonesia and Mercosur. As a union, we must promote our strategic interest and our values in this cooperation. We must remain the principal champion of rule-based world order. We must continue to stand for what served us so well in the past. Second, we must step up our efforts to combat climate change. As Sweden and several other EU countries have already shown, economic growth and innovation can go hand in hand with lower greenhouse gas emissions. Today, business are in fact demanding that we speed up the green transition. Energy policy plays a key role in this transition. To combat climate change, we have to get rid of fossil fuels, and Russia has now made it clear to us how urgent we need to get rid of any dependency on their gas. The only way forward is to invest in fossil-free and reliable energy: wind, solar, hydroelectric, hydrogen and nuclear. Likewise, investments in sustainable transport systems and other technological innovation provide great opportunities for society. This is the essence of the green transition. Third, we need effective regulation to promote well-functioning markets, competition and innovation. We need to develop and deepen the single market, our crown jewel. For 30 years, the single market has delivered growth in Europe. Remaining barriers must be removed, and developing the markets for service and digital sectors is long overdue. During the Swedish presidency, we want to highlight this and put competitiveness issues front and in center. So why is this important? Because it's through competitive and innovative companies that we create sustainable growth, accelerate the green and digital transition, increase the resilience of the economy, and strengthen the Union's geopolitical importance. Finally, I would like to stress the importance of our common fundamental values and respect for the rule of law. Needless to say, our fundamental values and the rule of law are important in of themselves, but they also provide a trust that is necessary to deep cooperation in legal and economic matters that we have in the EU. Strong rule of law compliance offers investors legal and political safeguards. This increases the attractiveness and competitiveness in the single market. Furthermore, it is our value-based cooperation that makes EU special and distinguish us from other powers and blocs in a competitive world. Moreover, it is our values that attract countries like Ukraine into our Union. So thank you for your contributions and recommendations to the Swedish presidency. I look forward to a lively and engaging discussion here today and both now and in the month to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A lot to pick up there. Already a reference to Cecilia Malmström, former commissioner and member of the European Parliament, now a non-resident senior fellow of Peterson Institute for International Affairs and visiting professor at the University of Gothenburg. Maybe just to pick up one of the issues which was mentioned by the minister, this question of unity and in how far unity will hold in Europe, and also a question which we have been struggling with, is unity preventing us from being ambitious enough? Are we able to overcome that dilemma, keeping everyone on board, but then also doing what is necessary to address the challenges?
Thank you very much. Good morning. I'm delighted to be here with you today and honored to be in this panel. Well, taking off where you started, or where you ended rather, what we have seen in the Ukraine crisis is of course a remarkably and unique unity of the European Union and the willingness to act fast and quick with 8 big packages of sanctions, as they are called. Even if there has been some discussions, at least Europe has been united. So the question is, of course, whether this will remain, what challenges could be there. We know that Viktor Orban and the Hungarian government have vetoed or threatened to veto some of them and have diluted some of the sanctions as well. We know that there are strong forces within the Italian government, for instance, who have strong relations with Russia and Putin. We have seen demonstrations in several countries, in thousands, people demonstrating for peace, but also questioning whether the sanctions are not hurting Europe more than actually Russia. So this is a huge challenge for the Swedish presidency and others, of course, to try to stick Europe together, because there seems to be a very strong support by the citizens and a solidarity vis-à-vis the Ukrainian people, and seeing their suffering and how brutally an innocent country was invaded in the way it was, and how now Russia is really doing its utmost to make sure that the civilian population suffers and probably pushing them to leave the country as well. But the trick is, of course, to make sure that remains and to have a clear commitment, because this war will be going on for quite some time, but also showing that Europe can deliver on other areas. That is not only Ukraine. We have the economic crisis, entering into possible recession, and the energy crisis as well. And some of this, a lot of it is related to the war, but a lot of it is also post-COVID issues that has not really been dealt with. Because before the war, Europe was looking rather positive if you saw the statistics coming from different institutions, including the Commission, showing that there was a growth coming there. But there's still a lot of post-COVID suffering. We saw an increase of divisions within countries and between countries. And that also needs to be proven on the national level, of course, but also showing the citizens that Europe also is able to fulfill its environmental ambitions, its social ambitions, and revitalizing, which is the theme of this panel, Europe's role in a competitive world, investing in reforming the internal market, for instance, and making sure that Europe is there. I think we will also, and I think Ilke will touch upon this, but maybe we can come back in the discussion, seeing the future Ukraine membership of the European Union and also the enlargement process. We'll absolutely have to discuss how we organize the European Union. There will have to be painful reforms made, both when it comes to the budget, regional policies, agricultural policies, but also how we make decisions. And moving towards a more qualified majority in issues such as human rights and sanctions seems to be something that has rather big support. It can be done without treaty changes, because I don't think treaty changes would be on the agenda for quite some time. And probably this is a way forward, but it has also some traps. Of course. I also wanted to highlight another item, making more of a helicopter view, that the EU is, of course, squeezed today in a world with increased competition, especially between the US and China. And we see a politicization or a geopoliticization or even a securitization of trade and supply chains. Companies are asking, where can I buy my goods and services? But they have to take geopolitical considerations in a way we haven't seen in a very long time. 1,500 companies have left Russia, many of them European. They will not be able to go back until there is a peace agreed by Ukraine. And that has, of course, affected some of the trade. We are discovering that some of the commodities that we took for granted actually come from Russia or Ukraine. And that trade is, of course, for obvious reason, distorted. There are also distortions left from COVID, where we realized that we were vulnerable in certain goods. Obviously, first of all, medical equipment. That is being corrected now to make sure that there are stocks for a possible new pandemic or something similar in the health area. But also, I wanted to dwell a little bit about rare earth metals. Nickel, lithium, cobalt, copper, kieselguhr, platina. All these are needed in order to secure the transition to the green society. We need these in wind turbines, we need them in electric vehicles, we need them in all our technical equipments. And these are, processing of these are almost 85%, depends on how you count, processed or mined in China. And that leaves us, and I think the State Secretary touched briefly upon this in her introductory remarks yesterday afternoon. So this is, of course, something that we need to talk about. And I saw a figure that these metals would need to increase by 500% to satisfy European needs until 2030. And even if that is an exaggeration, it's still a high number. And China, an increasingly unreliable partner, both for the side effects of COVID, but also shortages. And we know that when China doesn't like a country's behavior, it can punish it. We have seen that in Australia, where lots of trade is distorted because of bad political behavior. We saw it in Lithuania, and we have seen it before. So companies, of course, need to start looking elsewhere. I think overall, if you look at trade, companies have shown a good ability to be more flexible, diverse, resilient, and looking around. But there are, of course, all these vulnerabilities. And then comes politics in, with the President of the United States, for instance, and his State Secretary for Finance talking about friendshoring, reshoring, homeshoring, decoupling, new words in the trade dictionary that we didn't know, and the US trade war, because that's what it is, vis-à-vis China, with export controls and strong restrictions on what can be exported and not. And a push on Europe to be tougher on China. Europe has been tougher in many ways, setting up trade defense instruments, not only directed vis-à-vis China, but of course a lot vis-à-vis China when it comes to investment screening, when it comes to anti-coercion, when it comes to due diligence, etc. But of course Europe also needs to find a China strategy on its own, engaging with China on multilateral reform, on trade, on fairer trade, but still trade, and on the transition to the fossil-free economy and in the Paris agreements. So this is a balance, but still these products are only between 1.5% and 2% of all product categories that Europe imports. So we should be careful in not building up a protectionist regime for all other products that we need to do. So what needs to be done, and I'll finish with this, expanding the circle of friends. Trade is an important matter because trade is also encompassed in broader partnership agreements. We have them with several friends. We have ready agreements, and I hope that the Swedish presidency will ratify the ones with Chile, Mexico, New Zealand, and hopefully Mercosur. Finalize with Australia. Not finalize, I don't think you can do this, despite good intentions with India, but at least moving forward. Make sure that the Trade and Tech Council is a little bit more operational when it comes to standards and green trade, etc. Engage with the most dynamic region in this world, Asia Pacific, where we see a lot of trade agreements being made both regionally, bilaterally, and overall. Maybe joining the CPTPP. And also engaging more with Africa, where the intercontinental integration is actually moving forward slowly but steady. And of course finding a strategy on China. And the very last thing, I hope we can come back to this, keep working on modernizing and strengthening the international institutions such as the WTO, because that is crucial in a world that is marked by rivalry and competition and protectionism, that we have strong global rules, and that is unfortunately not the case today. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot, and also a lot to come back to. I'll definitely want to pick up the last point about international institutions and whether they are more dead than alive at this moment in time, and how we address that. But turning to the last opening statements, Ilke Teuger, who's Senior Associate with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Europe, Russia and Eurasia program, so covering a lot of the areas we've already talked about in Berlin. And maybe I want to put a bit of a challenge out to you, because we've heard on delivering on all of these objectives in a world which is contested, which is very competitive. And is Europe still able to shape that world? Is it able to shape these international relations? Just a small question. And starting with our neighborhood, are we able to shape our neighborhood? Please.
Thank you very much. Let me use a couple of my minutes to thank Swedish Institute of International Relations and TEPSA for this great organization and also for inviting me. I think there is no doubt that I'm extremely honored to share a panel with Mrs. Minister and with ex-commissioner, with Cecilia and Fabienne, of course. I'm even a bit intimidated for being the last speaker in this great panel. But I think I have only one main aim in my initial remarks. And that is to convince you why the European Union's relations in the continent and beyond are extremely important for the question that we have in this panel: what should the EU do in such a competitive world? Strengthen relations. And I have 3 points related to that. I know it sounds trivial. No, it's like we all know that friendship is a good thing. But if we do an audit of the relations of the EU, we are not starting from an extremely nice point. And this is correct for the continental relations. We have been taking steps about that. This is also true for transatlantic relations and other relations in the world. And I'm going to come to that. But my point for encouraging all of you to think about relations of the EU is that it's basically twofold. Because first of all, and I'm going to come detailed on that, most of the geopolitical threats today are threats without borders. And secondly, as Cecilia already mentioned, and I will try to complement that a bit, globalization is moving from efficiency to resilience. And thirdly, even if we know these 2 points, we are not necessarily acting upon that, neither in the continent nor in the other alliances. So I will try to elaborate on this a bit. The first point about most of the threats being without borders, because we have seen, we have the conventional war back in the continent, but we also have disinformation war, serious issues about food security, attacks on all kinds of networks, like the normal conventional networks of railways, etc., but also information systems, all kinds of infrastructure, critical infrastructure indeed, in member states and in the neighborhood. We have all these crises related to the energy and supply chains as a tool of power. And we shouldn't forget clearly about global health and the pandemic that we have just been through. Why I'm repeating all these challenges? Because all these challenges are threats without borders. Because this dimension brings me to my second connected point in the first point, to the concept of connectivity. Because I know we come from the tradition, at least since the end of the Cold War, that interdependencies were good. No, interdependencies would strengthen trade relations, and they would even eventually improve the democratic credentials of our trade partners. But today, instead, we're talking about how dependencies may harm us in the future. And China is coming back to the conversation about that. And this concept of connectivity in the neighborhood, in the continent and beyond is going to be more and more important when we think about these threats without borders. Secondly, globalization is moving from efficiency to resilience. Because again, Cecilia Malmström would know way better than I do, but the shaping of world trade was based on cost efficiency. And more and more we are hearing about nearshoring, friendshoring, shortening supply chains, but not only shortening, making them based in our countries, in our friend countries, like-minded countries, which opens a very big question about who the like-minded countries are when we are looking from the EU's perspective. Because the energy crisis showed us that we cannot assure our energy needs, at least for now, from like-minded friendly countries. We have seen the EU going and getting energy from not that like-minded countries. So this is definitely a debate, and we have started this conversation yesterday. You know, it's like how the EU is going to relate to friends and like-minded countries, allies, and how it is going to speak to other countries that it needs to have rules-based relationships. I'm going to come back to that. I know this is way easier said than done, but I think it's a very, very important point. So today, I also want to underline in this point one crucial thing. We shouldn't be talking about deglobalization. We should be talking about reorganization of globalization. And this reorganization, if we want this to kind of be in line with the EU's interests and values, the EU has a very big role to play in this reorganization of globalization. So actually, this is for me, it's a very important point. And this connects me to my very last and very wide point on what should the EU do in the continent, in the European continent, and transatlantic relations, and in the triangle EU, US, China, because for me, and according to my expertise, these are the areas that I can contribute the most to the conversation. Let's start with the continent very briefly. We already discussed the enlargement policy at wide in this conference, but for me, we have different pieces of the puzzle that we should be thinking when it comes to the continent itself. Because we have enlargement policy, we have Eastern Partnership as a part of the European Neighbourhood Policy, and we have EFTA countries or European Economic Area plus Switzerland to think about. So we have different frameworks. I know we are more centered in enlargement right now also because of the new candidates, and we were lacking momentum very much, and now we got it, we want to move there. But when we think about enlargement, I think we have two processes there. One is the juridical internal process that we all know that the candidate countries have to align with the EU acquis. And on the other hand, we have this geopolitical approach which requires the EU to connect candidate countries as fast as possible. And this is not new. All these agreements with the Western Balkans and association trio, all these association agreements that we had already were based in increasing connectivity, infrastructure, and all the electricity networks, roaming, all kinds of dimensions of connectivity. So we have two tracks. And I strongly think, even if I have been a very pro-enlargement person all my life, the second dimension of connectivity and how to connect all these countries better to the EU should be very much on the table. I want to spend a few minutes on the European political community, because I know that's a strange animal. We still don't know what to do with it. But I personally think that's a contribution so far to continental security and cooperation. Don't quote me on this, because we still need to see where this is going. Now, we just had one meeting. But I personally think, and I wrote about this previously, that we have an institution. Oh, we have an entity, because we can't even call it an institution. No? It's like, we have an entity, this is 44 countries. It's out of the EU's own programs and frameworks. So for the countries that are tired of EU's programs, this is kind of a good chance. But we have the luxury of going back to the EU's resources whenever necessary. They decide sending a civilian mission to Armenia and Azerbaijan. This is a success of European political community. Then they go back and call Borrell or Sanino and say, like, okay, European External Action Service and the European Commission should be organizing the civilian mission to Armenia and Azerbaijan. So actually, we have an interesting entity there that can be independent and cooperate with the partners in the continent in an equal footing, but draw back to the EU's resources whenever necessary. These are definitely initial observations about the EPC, but I want to say that this intelligent connectivity, I'm going to coin that term. Let's see if it sticks in at TEPSA. This intelligent connectivity is quite important when it comes to the EU's neighborhood. And last remarks about the transatlantic relations, because I think we can pick up on that, Fabian. I personally think there's a very important relation there. I think I don't need to convince that we need to invest in transatlantic relations. But I think, again, this is an area that we have to invest smartly. Because even if, because of the war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we have great coordination, cooperation on sanctions, on aid. We have a perfect storm coming with the transatlantic allies when it comes to trade policy and China policymaking. And even if I don't expect the EU to be equidistant to China and the US, and I don't want that, I really think that the EU has a fair arbitrator role to play in the future to come. So it has to be independent enough, which is, again, hard task, to push back ill-considered policies when it comes to protectionism in trade. So we should invest in transatlantic relations, and I'm definitely going to pick up more on that, but I think I'm going way beyond my time limit. But in a smart way. So it's a tough world out there. Globalization is changing. We should invest in the continent. We should invest in transatlantic relations in a smart way. I think I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Just one little quibble. The European political community is not EPC. That is something we have called them EPOC, and I think that's a much better name. But in any case, I think there's a lot there to follow up on, and I want to start a bit with the really big picture, the global superpower situation, and where the transatlantic relationship fits into that. And maybe picking up from there, you were talking about investing in the transatlantic relationship. But I want to unpack a little bit this question of like-minded countries. Because clearly the US have played a very important, a very appreciated role in the conflict with Russia, in the support of Ukraine. But when it comes to economic relations, there are also challenges there. And over the last days, we've seen that some of these challenges have erupted a bit. This question of the subsidy race, the question of protectionism, the question of my country first, buy America. All of these are very big challenges to that relationship. In how far will that shape our economic relationship with the US? In how far is Europe able to put down a more proactive, a more assertive position when it comes to these challenges? Because clearly there are real economic challenges there, and what increasingly it looks like is that our industrial base is very much under threat. If we look at the combination of what these subsidies mean with energy prices, which are very different in the US than here. So maybe I'll start with Cecilia to talk a bit about to solve the question.
Well, it is a very important and difficult question, because on the one hand, the contact and the intensity of contacts between Brussels and Washington are closer than in many, many years. The video conferences, the phone calls, the personal meetings on Ukraine. And there, I think it works very well. And the Trade and Tech Council that was created not to do Ukraine, but to do other things, actually had turned into a very good forum to discuss the implementation, the evaluation, one day maybe the phasing out, and how the sanctions work. And that is a good thing. Then there are these economic challenges, because of course the Biden administration is very much focused on Buy America, America First. It is more or less the same politics as the former administration, packaged it in a slightly different way, but the politics are the same, if not worse, in a way. And they have said very clearly that they do not want to make trade agreements that are affecting, market access, to the great disappointment of many partners. And that's where we are. So we need to live with what is there. There is the Trade and Tech Council. It will meet on Monday. It is a trust-building forum, which is good. But it is very much a talking shop, I have to say, unfortunately. And now there will be some outcomes, strategy on AI ethics, and some joint investments in Kenya and I think Jamaica on infrastructure, on this connectivity project that Europe has as an alternative to the Belt and Road, and a few other things. But it should go much deeper. It will not be a trade agreement, obviously, but it should go much deeper in talking about standards, about how to cooperate, how to avoid a subsidy race, because what we're seeing in the US, in China, but also more and more in Europe is worrying. There will be a lot of semiconductors in a few years, far too many than the world needs. And now we have this discussion on the Inflation Reduction Act, which is, as a whole, a very important piece of legislation. It is very progressive when it comes to investing in green technology and green transition in the US, and it should be welcomed. But it has these elements that are perceived in Europe as threatening. Some of them are directly discriminatory, the subsidies to electric vehicles, if they are made and assembled in the US, that is not in compliance with the WTO rules, but as WTO doesn't function on the appellate body, you can take it there, but it could be important and symbolic, but it will not change. Now, President Macron is there, and I just saw a press statement by President Biden saying that IRA is not intended to exclude US allies, and there are tweaks that we can make to make it easier for European countries to participate. We'll see what that means in practice, but it is a good step forward, because it would be very unfortunate, and this is I can talk only for myself now, if Europe also engaged in a Made in Europe race. That would damage the relations both with the US and internally. And it would be even more challenging if some countries engage in France first or Germany first, because that will have severe distortions on the internal market, because most countries cannot do that. So let's hope that we can solve this, and let's hope that the different working groups that are there can find a way to make intelligent subsidies, but not on the expense of friends. If you want to friendshore, you should trade and liaise with friends and not build new animosities. So let's see, it's a first important step. There will be continued discussions in the US on Monday with the Trade and Tech Council meets, and let's see if they can, if not solve, at least calm the worries a bit. But I'm not sure.
Thanks very much. I'll come to you, Minister. Also, of course, feel free to comment on the other interventions as well. But one of the questions which I think this raises is the question of in how far are we actually ready to cooperate in Europe on these kind of issues. And I think this is a particular challenge because I think what Cecilia just mentioned, if we don't cooperate at the European level, I think it is inevitable that you get a France first, a Germany first, because there has to be a response to these kind of developments. So how can we actually manage that, and how can we overcome also some of the dysfunctionalities? If we're talking about, I mean, these are elements of industrial policy, we have struggled to put together a meaningful industrial policy at the European level. So maybe the Swedish presidency will solve all of these problems.
Easy.
Please.
Easy task. No, absolutely. But I feel that you are both hopeful and a little bit not that hopeful about the Inflation Reduction Act. But so that has occupied my and my colleagues for quite much the recent days. But I haven't read the latest news, obviously. No, but anyway. My goal and the government's goal with having competitiveness high on the agenda is both on a short-term basis, because I think that EU has not talked about these questions in a fruitful way the last, I don't know, decades maybe. So it's important, and that it all goes hand in hand. If we don't have, if EU, and I think you said smartly invest in that relation, I think that is important, and that is what the role of EU should be. And it's important not to drag into the discussion as this Inflation Reduction Act tend to get. And I feel also my European colleagues sometimes also talk about subsidies raise, and we all say we don't want to go there, but still we tend to talk about it a little bit. And I'm worried about a trade war, and that would not be satisfying for Sweden and absolutely not for EU neither. So so the question is, how can we cooperate on this? Yeah, I don't really know yet, but I am hopeful, because all the contacts that I have during my first 6 weeks, and also the previous government has been taken well in hand, I should say. But of course, not from everyone, but I think we have. I think all of us realize that we cannot just be in this crisis mode. That we have had the pandemic with crisis. We have to fix things, and also the Ukrainian war. We have to fix things, and we have energy crisis. Hopefully smart, but also very. Instruments that we have to get in places very urgently, but we also have to think in the long term, and that's where EU can really make a difference, and that's also the goal of the one why we want to cooperate in this. EU can do a difference. That's my goal. But also, of course, we have to have a smart. I hooked up on that word because we have to have good relation with the trade and transatlantic link, but also have to do it smartly, and that's also when it comes to China, of course. But I'm hopeful, and I think that it's we will not solve it during the Swedish presidency, unfortunately, but I hope that we can put it high on the agenda and that lead to stop, and we can see some fruit of it in the next years to come.
Oh, thank you. Ilke, so I think we have to pick up the smartly invest. What does that mean? Also, and in the context of Europe's soft power and the challenge, which I think is there, that we talk a lot about soft power, but my appreciation is actually that we're pretty bad at it. That we are good at talking about it, but when it comes to investing in soft power, we actually don't do it. And that also maybe in the context of China. I think this is clearly one of the big questions. You have said we should be not equidistant, but we should somewhere be an honest broker in this superpower rivalry. Is that realistic? Also given what has been happening with the US support in our security? Can we really resist the undoubted demands which will come from Washington?
Again, very, very important set of questions. Let me take a step back, because when it comes to transatlantic relations, I know the institutions that were recently established are a bit more than a talk shop. But the thing is, I really care about taking Trade Council, EU-US dialogue on China, which has happened yesterday, and TTC next week, are still very good platforms. And one of the third points I want to add, that we are witnessing a very good relationship between the State Department and European Commission. They adore von der Leyen in Washington. I know this is not necessarily resonating well in Brussels, but I think this is an important link, because European Commission has all kinds of expertise at the House, and we should definitely use this in our service. When it comes to transatlantic relations and China, I think there are some concrete steps that could be taken. Let me elaborate on them very, very shortly. This is an immense issue. But the first one is related to these institutions and the good relationship between the State Department and the European Commission. Increase consultations. You don't need to agree on things. This can only be a talking shop, but you have to talk to each other. EU and the US cannot take their relationship granted ever, even under President Biden. So there should be very serious conversations, and I'm sure they are doing that in these meetings, about the priorities of Europe, priorities of the US, and talk about that. And the second point, but maybe Cecilia could elaborate more on that, is that sharing best practices. Because one of the biggest criticisms that is coming from the US to the EU is that it is still hanging on its dependencies. It's like, for example, Germany is criticized a lot because it was first dependent on energy country to Russia, and now it is dependent on China, on semiconductors. I'm not going to add on the market and the innovation capacity of the market, etc. That's a very big puzzle as well. But if there is a criticism as such, why the EU is not doing an EU-level audit on dependencies while the US is sharing best practices with the allies? So for me, this is a second idea that could be very useful. And the third one, when it comes to the American demands, if the US is very much concerned about China's influence, Chinese presence in wider Europe, Chinese presence in different regions, why the EU and the US don't cooperate more systematically, first in wider Europe, to counter the footprint of China, because that is in the interest of the EU itself as well, and in other regions. Von der Leyen already mentioned this in the State of the Union speech. She only referred once to United States, and that was for cooperation between Global Gateway and the United States to counter Chinese footprint in Africa and Latin America. So I personally think there are still areas that we could focus on as areas of cooperation and collaboration. We smartly pretend that we are answering the demands coming from the US because we can cooperate in wider Europe, in different regions. We can share best practices. Then when it comes to protectionism, when it comes to America first, when it comes to distorting trade relations in the world, we can say, hey, the EU's DNA has free trade, and this is going to be a very big challenge to keep track on that. But I think this is a very important role for the EU, and another challenge for looking for allies to, well, I would say even like start with modernizing customs union first, and then go modernize WTO. But maybe that's too much to ask anyway. But this is the tough balance. EU cannot be equidistant. EU has to cooperate with the United States when it comes to counterbalance China's footprint, but it has to be an honest broker when it comes to protectionism, when it comes to trade wars. I don't want to use that word when there's an actual war, but trade wars. And it should really push back in these measures in the world, hopefully with the help of other allies that are in line with its multilateral preferences in the world.
Thanks. Cecilia, you already touched on this when you were talking about the WTO and the international economic order, which has been very beneficial for Europe, but in many ways you were saying it's not functioning. Maybe it goes further than that, because it's very hard to see how we can make that function. What is the role of international organizations in a world where it's much more about my country first? Can we find a way of reforming the WTO in a meaningful way, which actually means that it can go back to the role it has had in the past?
Well, we certainly have to try. The European Union is a creation that functions best in a world where there are rules, where you can, there's a multilateral order, there are international organizations, there are norms, so you know what to relate to, because the EU is very much built upon those principles itself. And I very much agree with Ilke saying that we should reach out to allies to do this. When it comes to the Inflation Reduction Act, I know that the EU has been working very hard with Japan and Korea, who also feel discriminated by these subsidies issues. And jointly pushing the US to find ways forward. And the EU is also working very much with countries in the so-called Ottawa Group, which is a constellation of 20 countries all over the world who wants to reform the WTO in a meaningful way. And it has to continue doing this. It is very important that the EU does not give up to restore the multilateral order. The US talks a lot about WTO, but we haven't seen anything coming from this administration on this, which is a pity, because the WTO is also there to defend American interests, and the American business community wants a WTO that is functioning, where you can bring people or countries if they don't play by the rule. So the EU must continue to work on the small but significant progresses that were made at the ministerial conference in Geneva last June, where small baby steps, but still, were taken to reform the WTO. There was an agreement also to work on a reform agenda for the next ministerial in 1.5 years. That is very important that the EU leads on this and works with the US as well, try to identify what could possibly be a way forward to get the US back on board again, but also working with Australia, Japan, Canada, Norway, the UK, but also smaller countries in the world who want, and especially the developing world, because a WTO WTO that breaks apart would be very damaging to trade-dependent countries like Sweden, but also to the developing world, because it's thanks to that they can join the global trading scene. So that needs to be done. And then, of course, we have seen a weakening of many other organizations as well. G20, G7 seems to be catching up a little bit. The United Nations has not been able to act in the Ukraine crisis, for instance. NATO was brain dead 3 years ago, according to President Macron. Now it is stronger than ever, which is a good thing. But that also needs, that is a different conversation maybe, but the EU needs to see how it can complement NATO in the security and defense area as well. So I think maybe this sounds, idealistic, but the EU needs to keep on pushing to reform and strengthen the multilateral system.
Okay, thanks. We can hear about the agreement to that, but also maybe to also take it down a little bit closer to home, to look at our neighborhood, where clearly we still have an influence. There still is that power of attraction, but there are also big questions. Yesterday we had a conference where the deputy head of President Zelensky's office was speaking, and he was saying that accession negotiations should start now, and that he expects that Ukraine will be a member state of the European Union within 5 years. Now, this comes directly from the government in Ukraine. When I mention that, I hear the skepticism. So in how far are we able to be a credible actor within our neighborhood and overcome what we've called the rhetoric action gap? We are very good at making announcements, at making statements, but then how do we actually follow that up in terms of really delivering on the promises we are making?
No, it's a lot of questions in that question, but let me start in Ursula von der Leyen's speech when she her first speech to the Union. I think it was when she talked about the Commission. This Commission is going to be this Commission is going to be a geopolitical commission. And I know that a lot of us, I was in opposition, and then we were little bit discussion what that meant actually. Today, with war in Ukraine, we all know what that means, and it's of great importance. And I share with you, Ilke, that this wider Europe is, we can all see why it's important. And also, just to, you said that I flip a little about also European political community is, you said it's a contribution. I think it's an important contribution to the discussion. But on the question on widening and enlargement, it is complicated because we cannot continue to promise things and then not deliver, as you say. I think that's important, but it will also put forward questions that you, Cecilia, mentioned. How can we organize the EU when we become very many more members? So it's a lot of questions, but I think they can be solved. But because they are really important because of the geopolitical situation. So when it comes to what can what can we do during the Swedish presidency? We have put it on the agenda, as I said, like Ukraine for the whole, but also to give the support on political level. How can we take not only Ukraine, how can they put the enlargement process an agenda, but I think it's also important to give the signal that we actually do something on this, how they can. And so there is a time schedule for this from the Commission, and we will try to have it as a discussion and also during our presidency. I cannot promise anything today, but I think it's highlighted in the agenda. But there is also a question of economic support because we have this rebuilding of Ukraine, which will also have great impact of the European Union, because it would cost a lot of money. So there's a lot of questions parallel in this discussion. But I think it's we have to somehow also deliver on the promises that we give. But for me, this is, I didn't know what you said, Lilke, but I'm still an enlargement friend. And I am still an enlargement friend. I will see a greater, wider Europe, because it makes us stronger.
Picking up on that, Ilke, yes, we have seen a big change also with EPOC, with the discussion which
That's
has
not
been
going to
there.
stick, Fabian. No,
It
I'm
will
sorry.
stick. But I think the question for me is, when we look at our enlargement process, we have promised a lot and we have not kept those promises. And even now, yes, we are talking about it, but how credible is what we are saying in relation particularly to the Western Balkans, where they have been in a waiting room for a rather long time, and we have not delivered, and maybe we won't deliver in the near future.
I think this is when I talk about investing in relations, and more realistic conversation in wider Europe could be, together with transatlantic relations, the two most important pieces. I really care about this, and whatever remains from the mandate of this commission and the forthcoming commission after 2024 has this great challenge of setting things more inside. This is an issue where really, in practice, I try to mention that in my initial remarks, that we are actually literally in a two-track conversation right now. One is this candidacy official, which requires alignment with the EU acquis, and for some people this is a technicality. For me, aligning with the acquis goes to the very core of the European Union and to the core of the single market. I think we should repeat this, because for some people this may look like a detail, but actually the ever-growing EU acquis is a very important thing in the single market. So we have this track, no? It's like the candidate countries, their candidates start accession negotiations and try to align with the EU acquis, which is a tough task. But then we have all the rest of the track, which we already had going with the association agreements to connect these countries to the EU. And there should be a smart way. They continue aligning. They continue on their path to the EU in a traditional way, but at the same time, we try to use all the capacity of all the creativity of the European Commission to include them in electricity contracts, to create infrastructure, to connect like Western Balkans to the EU with roads, railways, try to connect them via information networks, etc. I know this sounds like compromise, but in my personal opinion, the EU kind of reached to its limits of functioning, actually a couple of countries before, but I'm not going to get to that, in the current setup. So we require 3 additional conversations. 1, internal reform. This is not a joke. We need to make it better, otherwise we're going to break it. The second one is a fair process of enlargement for all the candidate countries. If they are advancing in their acquis alignment, and this is a big if, important if, not a technical detail, they are advancing in their process of becoming a member. This is fair and square. And the third one is, for the countries that are not necessarily advancing in their processes, they can't at this moment, but they are still very important players of wider Europe, and I can name Turkey here. We are finding smart ways of collaborating and cooperating with them. I know this will sound amazing in a think tank commentary. It is a very big headache for European decision makers. But this is, we can talk about any other idealistic things. I can comment on my personal opinions, but the reality in wider Europe right now, we need to guarantee security and security cooperation and any other cooperation. We have to use connectivity and platforms like European Political Community, EPOC, just for the sake of our great moderator. And in the meantime, open up the fair and square conversation of, okay, this is the EU we have, this is where we are trying to go, we need to reform. But if you are playing by the rules, aligning with the acquis, because acquis is very important for ABC, and then you will become members. I think we need transparency, we need openness, and we need various parallel conversations to make things right, both for the Western Balkans and for Association Trio, and hopefully if there is political change in Turkey, for Turkey as well.
Thanks. Cecilia, picking up on that, I think it's clear that our role in this competitive world depends very much on what we do internally. The internal reforms, the kind of things which are mentioned, but how credible are we when we have internal challenges which we are not overcoming? Just to mention the rule of law problem and the associated problems we've seen now, that one country can hold up the union when it comes to these important decisions of how we act in the world.
Well, that is, of course, the big question, because I fully agree with Ilke's sort of three-path forward that we need to do. But the first thing to do is, of course, to make your own homework and to keep your own house in order. And we have within the European Union severe problems with rule of law, with corruption, with undermining of the free press, etc. Not only Poland and Hungary, even if they are the biggest sinners, but also in other countries. If you read the internal reports from the Commission on rule of law, but also if you look at the greater academic community ranking countries. And right now, with the big conflict with Hungary, is of course, remains to be seen how that is handled. Now the Commission has proposed to withhold money both from the recovery fund and the common budget. Referring to the newly established conditionality mechanism. Let's see if that is upheld by the Council, who needs to decide upon that in a couple of days or weeks. This first meeting, I think, on Tuesday, but it would probably not be decisive, but still. So that is, of course, the question. It is for the European Union credibility to criticize the breaks of the violation of rule of law in other countries as well, but also in this enlargement process, because there is this enlargement fatigue that Europe has been suffering from for such a long time, and Balkan has been the victims of that. Is of course that it didn't. These democracies, the new democracies that we took in, and I'm fully convinced that was a good thing to do, but they were weak and vulnerable, and look at the consequences right now. And also it has not only effects on the European Union, but also, as you said, Fabian, Hungary is threatening to veto several Russia and Ukraine related. It has also put its veto on this global tax that the OECD has managed to get 124 countries to sign, and Hungary is blocking that as well. And it also blocked a joint statement by the European Union condemning the sort of the Chinese taking of Hong Kong. Orban blocked that as well, which means that yes, we need to find a methodology to work with these issues in a more systemic way, and we also need to change our decision-making processes and so on at the same time. But Hungary and also Poland, there's less pressure on Poland right now because they are taking so many refugees from Ukraine, and they should be thanked for that. But there is also severe problems related to rule of law, independence of media, the treatment of LGBT people, etc. that needs to be addressed. So I don't have the solution for that. I hope that the Commission can stay strong and that member states will actually take the decision to show the Hungarian government, not the Hungarian people, the Hungarian government, that if you want to be in this club, you have to play by the rules, and if not, you're not going to play your own game with our taxpayers' money, because that's what it's about.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's also about credibility for the European Union as itself. We worked very hard on the conditionality mechanism, and we really need to see that it works. So these are very important days. But I also hear, and I think that Poland, it does not just that we are nice to Poland because they take a lot of refugees. I think they actually yeah. But on the enlargement question also, I didn't say the obvious. This will not be easy. I was very hopeful. I realized it's a unit. So it's not going to be easy, but it's important as I see it. But I forgot the little detail.
But maybe just to follow up on also the decision-making processes, because I think it doesn't look very good for the European Union when we have our leaders meeting and at the end of it we come out and say, well, there are a lot of things we can't do because a country doesn't agree with it. So how can we tackle that decision-making problem where through the veto mechanisms we giving individual countries the power to hold up the rest of the union? And in particular, I think how far are also the member states willing to accept that any form of changes to this decision making will also affect them. It will also be, and I've heard it from a lot of the smaller countries, there's a lot of worry about that. But don't we have to make progress on how we take decisions as well?
It's well, Sweden has, and we have been in well, all the parties, I think, has, not all, but mostly all the parties in the parliament has think that there are questions, there are areas where we think we should go to qualified majority voting, for example, like sanctions and foreign policy. But there are other countries, as we all know, that don't see that. They have other questions and other areas. So I think as a incoming presidency, I see problems in uniting the member states to agree on which where in which areas we should go for another organization and or decision making. But I think it's good that we have this discussion, and I would like to say that we could move forward on this. But I see, as I say, this will not neither be very easy. And I also would say that I would not like that the EU, we have a lot, as I mentioned in the beginning, we are in war, we are having an energy crisis, we're going in an economic crisis. We need also to focus on the problem and solve that, and not end up, because sometimes, and Cecilia probably knows more about this than I, that when it comes to when EU discuss regulation, internal regulation and verdrags, treaty changes, it tends to go in-house and internal. I think we have to focus on the problems that we see ahead. So it's not maybe that the answer that you wanted to hear, but I think we need to stay focused on the problem.
Thanks very much. I have so many more questions, but I also want to see whether in the audience there are any questions. I'm sure there will be others who want to come in. I see 3 now, and maybe we'll take those 3 and then come back to the panel. But please keep them really short so that we have enough time to also try to answer them. So I saw one there. Yeah.
Thank you. I hope it's on. So my name is Alexandra Palkova. I represent Latvian Institute of International Affairs, and I want to touch up not on the enlargement, but what Ilke said about like-minded partners, and that we have to have more initiatives and mechanisms to actually work with them. So, for instance, let me put that straight. EU and US have a great example of the Trade and Technological Council initiative, which I consider as a great mechanism to work on the trade, global issues, cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, and more on. But what I see that the member states actually do not talk a lot of that. So my question is how we can actually maybe work on how we can ensure the efficiency of the mechanism, what we already initiatives we have, then just not create the new ones, because I don't see the debate, for instance, in South so much about EU and US Trade and Technology Council. It's more about the debate maybe in the Baltics and ESA, but that's quite a major initiative actually that helps a lot, especially given the like-minded partners. And Ilke, what you said, that we have to actually have those initiatives. We have already one, so why we didn't talk about that more? Thank you.
Okay, then there was...
Does this work? My question is very, very short, and it's directed to Ilke. You mentioned security guarantees, if I'm not mistaken. Who should provide security guarantees in the context that you were referring to? Thank you.
And there was...
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. I'm Andrei Radulescu from Romania, the chief economist of the largest bank there, and also senior fellow of Romania Academy. I have 2 brief questions. First one regards the current challenges at the EU level. I had a presentation in Maastricht 2 months ago. Don't you think political integration is the final solution? Because we have several projects under implementation, but we didn't manage to implement fully the new economic governance established after the Great Recession. And Europe seems to be in the middle of the total economic confrontation between the United States and China. And actually, from the economic point of view, Europe is paying the invoice of what's happening nowadays in Ukraine. We are paying higher energy prices, higher food prices. We, at the European level, we pass from surplus of trade balance to deficit of the trade balance. Actually, Europe needs to reform the economic model, because this economic model over the past 3 decades was based on imports of cheap oil and gas from Russia and on exports of high value-added goods to China. So this, the first question regards, is a priority for the Swedish presidency of the European Union to push forward efforts in terms of federalism and political integration? This would be the final solution. It's according to the optimal currency area theory. Europe needs to push forward towards political integration. The second question regards the fact that, being from Romania, the Schengen enlargement. And I know that a lot of debates are nowadays on this topic. And I know that countries like Romania invested a lot in order to secure the eastern frontier of Europe. And would be a priority also this Schengen enlargement, and including the Romania in the Schengen area? Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much. I'll start with Ilke, maybe also on the security guarantees. Given that it looks like the war in Ukraine is not going to be over anytime soon, with all the tragic consequences that had. But that also, in the context of security guarantees, is a real challenge. And particular, we already started talking about EU membership. We have a security guarantee in the treaties. How would that go in a conflict situation where the conflict is not resolved?
Actually, I didn't say anything about security guarantees, but I'm very happy to thank you very much for the questions. For me, looking from a very practical institutional point of view, at this very moment, Ukraine is not a member of the EU, not a member of NATO. So for the security guarantees, we need a more international consortium, let's put it that way. Like the conversation of reconstruction is going on in a rather multilateral platform, led by, of course, some countries in the EU, but in a more international setting. I think when the time comes, the security guarantees should be discussed in that matter as well. And it would be interesting, actually, because we may also see unexpected countries to come up and would like to provide some kind of security guarantees. I'm even like thinking about Turkey in that settlement. But I think the conversation should be international, multinational, as much as it gets, because there are so many countries. It's in all our interest that Russia or any other country should not invade another sovereign country anytime in the near future or beyond our lifetimes. Because for me, of course, we are having an actual situation with Ukraine right now, but this is also a very big failure in international agreements and the understanding of sovereignty and indivisibility of sovereign countries' borders. So even if we have an actual situation to treat, I think we should also take a step back and have an honest conversation in between international partners that how we can also prevent this from happening in the future. I might also take the question on TTC, if I may. Very good point. Actually, I think the scholars that are working on transatlantic relations are hanging very much to TTC, because it's a newly created platform, and it is, even if it's regarded most of a talking opportunity, I personally think talking opportunities are great. Just like talking to each other is a great step in comparison to what we had in under Trump administration. So of course, we should do more about the visibility of the platform, efficiency of the mechanisms that we have created. But for the EU, there will be more and more necessities of conversations, not only with the US, but Cecilia already named them, no? Australia, Japan, Korea, other groups like created ones like Ottawa Group. Anyone that would like to embark with the EU to reform multinational institutions, to talk about free trade and kind of to face this protectionist tendencies, they are welcomed. So I think this is an area where the intellectual community could play a role. No, it's like we can be as creative as we can be, and suggest better functioning mechanisms for the existing institutions or entities, and we can also suggest the creation of new ones, and cross fingers that our politicians will hear us. No,
Celia.
Just to add very briefly to what Ilke said on Trade and Tech Council, it is important that that is deepened. I think it is a talking shop, but I fully agree that it's a trust-building place, and on a lower level there are regular exchanges, building things, and it should actually be more institutionalized, because we need more institutional organizations or platforms between the EU and the US. Also looking at the next presidential election in the US, if Trump or someone like him comes back, we need to have functioning, institutionalized platforms where we can discuss matters of common concern. I just hope that it could be scaled up a little bit broadened, and also deliver some more concrete results, because there are so many challenges that the EU and US face together, and we might not always agree on everything, but at least showing that we make progress discussing it. And that's why I think there's such a big disappointment from the European Union that the IRA and the consequences of that was not discussed in this context. Had it been, lifted there, and I think also President Biden might regret this, because this was not the main issue of the Inflation Reduction Act. Maybe we could have avoided, the sourness that is still there. So hopefully that is a lesson, and I hope that context can be deepened and deliver more on standards, on subsidies, on semiconductors, on sustainable global value chains. Hopefully, if not the time now, on how to reform international organizations such as the WTO.
So, thank you. When it comes to federalism then, and Schengen, I would say that we are three parties, pro-European parties in this government, who will work for the whole mandate period, the term, for a strong Europe, and also one of the goals for me personally is also that Sweden takes a stronger place within the Union, because I think that is we have a lot of things to do that, and that's why I see that this presidency comes very perfectly in time for us to make this change, maybe. But and we are agreed on that. Well, I think I'm a European friend, has been for a very long time, but the EU for me is to solve questions that is better solved in a global European level, and sometimes it's we think that it's more the better to solve it on national level, and sometimes municipality level. So I don't call myself as federalist. And I don't think that will solve some of the problems that we maybe are going for. When it comes to Schengen, one of the big questions that we'll handle, I will just say that during the Swedish presidency, it's 350 files that are going to be negotiated. We are not going to close all of them. Sorry, I think. But one of the biggest one is the migration pact, which is content of several files, and the Schengen question, as I understand that the Commission and the Council the Czech presidency would like to solve that question before Christmas, or before and Sweden has. I think Gunnar Strömmer, the Minister of Justice, is at the Committee on European Affairs today, and will get the mandate to vote yes. On the Schengen. So that's what I can deliver for answer today. But then that's the hope.
Okay, thank you. We're almost out of time, but I want to go back to the panel for one last time with a 1-minute answer to a very difficult question, so I apologize already. I want to look ahead to the Swedish presidency and ask you, of all the things we've discussed today, where would you see we really have to make progress in the immediate future? What would be your political emphasis? And then, of course, hearing a reflection from the Swedish presidency of what kind of areas really are going to be in the forefront of the presidency. But Ilke, maybe the one area where we will measure success.
I think, well, okay, 1 minute answer. Wider Europe. Because I think this is an area we have to progress, and for the reasons that I have been mentioning in my remarks, that we need to build in a smart, sustainable, green, wider Europe, and we have different tools that require rethinking. And I think we just need to secure, we have to secure in such a competitive world a better coordination and cooperation with countries in the continent. So I'm going to say I hope there will be progress in better dealing, smarter dealing with wider Europe.
Thank you. Cecilia.
Lots of things on the Swedish presidency agenda. I wish you luck with all of it. But keeping Europe united would probably be the most challenging task. To keep Europe united vis-à-vis Ukraine and Russia, to keep Europe united vis-à-vis the transatlantic relations, and to try to find a common strategy vis-à-vis China, because we can't have solo playings back and forth. We need to have a thorough joint strategy there. So I wish you good luck with that. And also I hope that, we haven't touched upon this, but I want to say it to the protocol. I really hope you can move forward with the green agenda. Don't forget that. It is key for European citizens.
I said it in my the green agenda, but I know. Yeah, I hope. Yeah, yes.
Sorry, but we haven't talked
yes,
about
no,
it
no,
in the
sorry.
discussion. Yes, no, sorry.
no, but that is it's a hard way because we have to focus on the crisis, of course. But if you ask me what can we see the change and what can we remember from the Swedish presidency is that we have of course moved forward on as much as possible, but also focus on Ukraine, as I said. But then my hope and my goal is that we have actually put this competitiveness on the agenda for a long time, and that will make a difference, I hope, and it will be visible. That's also my goal.
Thank you very much. I think it's been a very rich discussion. What I take away from it is that, yes, we live in a world which is uniquely challenging, with the watershed moment of Russia's invasion, with the perma-crisis, COVID, the fiscal situation, the migration issue, all of these issues coming together. And also with the long-term transitions, which we have to progress. Of course, the green transition, the sustainability transition, but also the technological revolution which is taking place in the world at the moment. And I think what we have also seen increasingly, this question of economic security. How do we ensure that we can address our vulnerabilities? And I think that's the great challenge to all of us, not just the Swedish presidency. Can we find new answers? One thing which has struck me in a lot of these discussions since the watershed moment is that, yes, we recognize that the world has changed, but we haven't necessarily changed our policies to adjust to that. And the question is, how do we do that in a long-term way? In a sustainable way, but also how do we manage to do that at the European level and don't go back to a more fragmented world, which would be a great challenge to all of us. So thank you very much. I don't think we will have final answers for a long time, but I think the one thing I want to sort of give everyone to take away with, when we look at the current situation, then the answer cannot be, it can't be done. We have to be able to do the things we have been discussing today. So thank you very much to a great panel for this discussion. Thank you very much to the organizers, TEPSA and the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. And thank you very much to the audience for taking part in this. Thank you.